Security, remove her. The words cut clean through the soft violin music, sharp enough to turn heads without raising a voice. And just like that, every conversation in the room thinned into a hush as Ava Johnson's hand froze inches above the back of a white folding chair, her fingers hovering like she had touched something she wasn't supposed to, something invisible but understood by everyone watching, the kind of boundary no one explains but everyone enforces. The ballroom glowed in warm amber light, crystal. Chandeliers scattering reflections across polished floors, guests dressed in tailored suits and silk gowns holding champagne glasses at chest height, their laughter moments ago now reduced to tight smiles and sideways glances, and in the center of it all stood Ava, her navy dress simple, pressed but modest, her shoes low-heeled and practical, nothing about her loud except the silence forming around her, the kind that made absence feel louder than presence. She didn't look lost, not exactly, but she looked like someone placed just slightly out of frame, as if the picture had been composed without her in mind, and now her existence disrupted the symmetry. A woman near the aisle leaned closer to another guest, whispering behind manicured fingers, eyes flicking toward Ava before quickly retreating as if eye contact might confirm something uncomfortable, while a man in a charcoal suit adjusted his cufflinks with unnecessary focus, deliberately avoiding looking in her direction, the avoidance itself becoming its own kind of attention. Ava's grip tightened around the small cream-colored invitation in her hand. The paper softened from being held too long, edges slightly bent, her name printed there in formal script as undeniable as anything else in the room, yet somehow not enough. The scent of fresh roses drifted from arrangements lining the aisle, mixed with the faint sweetness of champagne and polished wood. Everything curated, everything controlled, and yet this moment, this single interruption, hung unresolved. A security guard near the entrance shifted his weight, unsure whether to move, waiting for a clearer signal, his eyes scanning between the woman who had spoken and Ava, as if the decision required permission beyond words. Ava inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising just enough to catch the light, then settling again, her expression calm, not defiant, not apologetic, just present, as though she understood something no one else had caught up to yet. Somewhere near the front, the groom stood at the altar, his posture still, his gaze forward. But something in the room had already begun to pull at the edges of that stillness, subtle but undeniable, like a thread being drawn tight beneath the surface. The music continued, but softer now, almost hesitant, each note stretching longer than it should, as if even the pianist could feel the shift. Ava didn't step back, didn't argue, didn't explain. She simply remained where she was, one hand resting lightly on the chair, the other holding the invitation against her side. And in that stillness, in that refusal to disappear, the tension deepened, because it wasn't just about whether she belonged. It was about who would decide that, and why no one had said her name yet. The silence did not break, it stretched, pulling tighter across the room as if every second added another invisible layer of pressure, and Ava Johnson stood within it without shifting her feet, her posture steady, her chin level, her breathing slow and measured like someone who had learned long ago that composure was not optional but necessary, her eyes moving just once across the rows of white chairs, past polished shoes and pressed suits, past carefully styled hair and diamond earrings that caught the chandelier light, until she found the empty seat she had intended to take, 3 rows from the back, near the aisle, a place that asked for nothing and offered even less attention. She had chosen it on purpose, not to be seen, not to interrupt, just to be present, because presence, to her, had never required permission. The invitation in her hand felt heavier now, the thick cardstock warm from her grip, the embossed lettering still clear despite the slight bend at the corner, her name written in full, Ava Johnson, followed by the date, the time, the location, everything precise, everything deliberate, and she remembered the moment she received it. The envelope arriving unexpectedly at her small apartment, slipped beneath the door by a mail carrier who did not wait for acknowledgment, the paper clean, expensive, unmistakably formal, and she had stood there for a long moment before opening it, unsure if it was meant for her, unsure if it was a mistake, but the name had been correct, the handwriting on the front unmistakable, familiar in a way that made her chest tighten before she even read the contents. She had almost not come, standing in front of her mirror that morning, smoothing down the fabric of the same navy dress she wore now, the one she reserved for occasions that required quiet respect, her reflection looking back at her not with doubt, but with a kind of careful resolve, because she knew what rooms like this could feel like. She knew the weight of glances that said nothing but meant everything, and still, she had folded the invitation, placed it in her purse, and stepped out into the early afternoon sunlight, the sky clear, the air warm against her skin, a soft breeze moving through the trees as if the world outside did not recognize the tension waiting inside these walls. Now, back in the ballroom, a server passed by carrying a tray of champagne flutes, slowing slightly as she approached the cluster of guests nearest Ava, her eyes flicking once toward Ava before she redirected her path entirely, offering drinks to others while leaving that small pocket of space untouched, a subtle adjustment that spoke louder than any words, and Ava noticed, not with surprise, but with the quiet acknowledgment of someone who had seen this pattern before, who understood the language of distance, the choreography of exclusion that unfolded without instruction. Near the front, the bride shifted her weight, her gown cascading in soft layers around her, her smile fixed but thinner now, her gaze briefly scanning the room before returning forward, as if she could sense the disruption without fully turning to face it, while the officiant cleared his throat softly, a gentle attempt to restore order, to guide the ceremony back onto its intended path, his voice calm as he began to speak again, though the words seemed to land unevenly, not quite settling as they should. Ava lowered her hand from the chair, letting it rest at her side, the invitation still held between her fingers, and for a moment, just a moment, her eyes softened, not with hesitation, but with memory, something distant yet present, something tied to this place, to this moment, to the name printed on that card, a connection that no one else in the room could see, not yet, and she took a small step forward, not toward the exit, not away from the tension, but toward the seat she had chosen, her movement quiet, deliberate, and in that single step, the air seemed to shift again, because it was no longer just about a woman standing where she was not expected. It was about a woman who knew exactly why she was there, even if no one else did. The room tried to recover, but it never fully did, because the kind of silence that follows judgment does not disappear, it lingers in the corners, in the way people hold their breath just a second too long, in the way conversations restart without warmth. And as Ava Johnson moved toward the seat she had chosen, every step measured, every motion controlled, the space around her adjusted again, subtle but deliberate, chairs shifting an inch, shoulders angling away, as if proximity itself had become something to manage. Near the front row, a woman in a pale gold dress leaned toward an older man with silver hair, her voice low but edged with certainty as she whispered, "She is not on the list," and the man nodded without checking, his expression tightening not with curiosity, but with conclusion, because in rooms like this, assumptions often arrived faster than facts. Along the aisle, a younger man in a tailored navy suit glanced down at a tablet in his hand, scrolling through what appeared to be a seating chart, his finger pausing midway before he looked up briefly toward Ava, his gaze lingering just long enough to confirm what he had already decided, then returning to the screen as if the answer was written there, as if ink and pixels carried more authority than the quiet presence of a person standing in front of him. The officiant continued speaking, his voice smooth, practiced, but the rhythm felt slightly off now, like a metronome that had been nudged out of alignment, each word landing but not settling, because attention in the room had fractured, split between the ceremony and the question no one had asked out loud. Ava reached the chair and rested her hand on its back again, this time not hesitating, her fingers tracing the smooth painted wood for a brief second before she turned it just enough to sit, the soft scrape against the floor barely audible, yet somehow magnified in the stillness. And as she lowered herself into the seat, she kept her back straight, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes forward, not seeking acknowledgment, not reacting to the glances that continued to pass over her like brief shadows. The invitation remained in her hand, now resting against her lap, the paper catching a sliver of chandelier light, and for a moment, She pressed her thumb gently against the printed letters of her name, as if grounding herself in something tangible, something undeniable. Across the aisle, a pair of guests exchanged a look, one raising an eyebrow, the other giving a slight shake of the head, their silent conversation carrying more weight than spoken words, because it reinforced the same quiet narrative forming across the room, that she was out of place, that her presence required explanation, that something about her did not fit the carefully curated image of the day. Near the entrance, the security guard took a step forward, then stopped, his posture uncertain, his eyes flicking once more toward the woman who had first spoken, waiting again for confirmation, for direction, for a signal that would turn hesitation into action. But no clear instruction came. Only the continuation of that thin, stretched silence. At the altar, the groom stood still, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, his expression composed. Yet there was a subtle shift in his focus now, a slight narrowing of his eyes, as if something had caught his attention beyond the expected line of sight, something just outside the script of the ceremony. And though he did not move, not yet, the stillness around him carried a different kind of weight, not uncertainty, but awareness. Ava did not look toward him, not directly, but something in her posture changed, almost imperceptible, a quiet steadiness settling deeper into her frame, as if she could feel that awareness without seeing it, as if she understood that the moment unfolding was not random, not accidental, but part of something that had been set in motion long before she stepped into the room. The music softened further, the notes stretching thin, and in that fragile balance between order and disruption, between expectation and truth, the ceremony continued. But no one present could ignore that it was no longer the same ceremony it had been just minutes before. The officiant's voice carried on, steady but thinner now, as if each word had to travel farther to reach the room. And Ava Johnson sat with her hands resting lightly in her lap, the invitation still between her fingers, her gaze fixed ahead, not on the altar itself, but somewhere just beyond it, a quiet focus that did not ask for acknowledgment yet refused to disappear. A few seats over, a woman shifted in her chair, crossing one leg over the other with a subtle exhale, her eyes flicking again toward Ava before settling forward, though the tension in her posture remained. While behind them, a man leaned closer to his companion and murmured something too low to hear, yet the reaction was immediate, a small, tight smile that did not reach the eyes, followed by a glance that lingered a second too long. The security guard near the entrance took another step, slower this time, his shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor, his gaze moving from Ava to the front of the room, and back again, as if waiting for the moment when uncertainty would turn into instruction. But that moment still did not come, only the continuation of that fragile balance hanging in the air. Ava adjusted the edge of the invitation with her thumb, smoothing the slight bend along the corner, a simple motion, almost absent-minded, yet grounded, deliberate, the kind of movement that belongs to someone who has learned to remain steady when everything around them shifts. And for a brief second, her eyes lowered to the printed script, tracing the familiar name, not just her own but the one written beneath it, the one that had brought her here, the one that now stood at the altar. The groom's posture changed, just slightly, a subtle shift of weight from one foot to the other, his shoulders drawing back as if he had taken a deeper breath than before, his attention no longer locked solely on the officiant, but divided, stretched between the ceremony and something else, something unresolved. And though his face remained composed, there was a quiet tension along his jaw, a tightening that did not belong to the scripted moment unfolding around him. The bride glanced at him, her expression soft but questioning, her hand resting lightly against his arm as if to anchor him back into place, back into the rhythm of the ceremony. And he responded with the smallest nod, almost automatic. Yet his eyes did not fully return to her, not completely, because something had already shifted inside him. Ava remained still, her back straight, her shoulders relaxed, her presence no longer tentative but certain, and in that certainty, the room felt it again, that subtle disruption, not loud, not visible in any single action, but present in the way people could not quite settle, could not fully return to the ease they had moments before, because her being there had introduced a question no one had answered. The music from the piano softened further, each note spaced just a fraction wider apart, as if the player could sense the tension without understanding its source, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, stretching, anticipating something not yet spoken. A server paused near the side of the room, tray balanced carefully in one hand, watching for a moment before moving again, slower this time, as though even routine actions required adjustment within this fragile atmosphere. Ava's fingers pressed lightly against the invitation once more, and then stilled, her hands coming to rest again, calm, grounded, while her eyes lifted just enough to meet the line of sight toward the altar, not directly, not fully, but enough to acknowledge what was there, what had always been there, even before anyone else noticed. And in that quiet alignment, between where she sat and where he stood, something unseen began to draw tighter, a connection unspoken yet undeniable, waiting just beneath the surface of the ceremony, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough. The officiant reached the part where vows were meant to begin, his voice lifting slightly as if trying to guide the moment back into something ceremonial, something predictable, but the air did not follow. It resisted, stretched thin by everything left unsaid, and Ava Johnson felt it settle heavier around her shoulders like a quiet weight she had carried before, not new, not unfamiliar, just present. A man seated one row ahead turned halfway in his chair, no longer pretending not to notice, his gaze direct now, assessing, and though he said nothing, the question in his eyes was clear. It lingered long enough that the woman beside him followed his line of sight, her expression tightening as recognition did not arrive, only doubt. Near the aisle, the security guard finally moved with more certainty, his steps measured but purposeful as he approached from the side, careful not to interrupt the ceremony outright, yet unable to ignore the silent expectation building around him. And when he reached the edge of Ava's row, he leaned slightly, his voice low, controlled, but firm enough to carry meaning beyond the words, asking if she could step outside for just a moment, a request shaped like politeness but edged with assumption. Ava turned her head toward him slowly, not startled, not offended, simply acknowledging his presence, her eyes meeting his with a calm that did not match the tension surrounding them. And for a second, he hesitated, as if her stillness disrupted the script he had prepared in his mind. She did not stand, she did not argue, she only lifted the invitation slightly, just enough for him to see the name, the printed confirmation that she belonged there as much as anyone else in the room. And then she lowered it again, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. The guard's eyes flicked to the card, then back to her face, uncertainty returning in a quiet ripple, his authority momentarily paused by something he could not dismiss, and behind him, the subtle movement had drawn more attention, heads turning more openly now, whispers no longer fully concealed, the fragile line between private judgment and public awareness beginning to blur. At the altar, the groom's hands shifted, unclasping, then coming together again as if the motion itself carried thought, his focus no longer divided but pulled, drawn toward the back of the room with a clarity that made the rest of the ceremony feel distant, almost secondary, and the bride felt it, her fingers tightening slightly around his arm, her smile faltering for just a fraction of a second before she composed it again, though the question in her eyes remained, unspoken but growing. The officiant paused, just briefly, sensing the shift he could not name, and in that pause, the room seemed to hold itself in place, waiting, suspended between continuation and interruption. Ava returned her gaze forward, not dismissing the guard, not challenging him, simply existing in the space she occupied, her hands resting again in her lap, the invitation now still, her presence quiet yet immovable, and that stillness began to carry a different kind of weight, no longer just an intrusion but a resistance, a refusal to be quietly erased. The guard straightened, stepping back half a pace, his uncertainty now visible, his role suddenly unclear in a situation that did not resolve the way it was expected to, and as he hesitated, the room felt it, that hesitation spreading outward, weakening the unspoken agreement that had formed moments earlier. The music from the piano faltered for a beat, then resumed, softer, uncertain, as if even the rhythm of the ceremony could sense that something larger was unfolding beneath its surface, something that would not be contained by polite requests or quiet glances, something that was waiting, just on the edge of being spoken aloud. The pause stretched longer than anyone expected, long enough for the soft hum of the air conditioning to become noticeable, long enough for the faint clink of glass from a distant table to echo slightly. And Ava Johnson sat without moving, her presence no longer just observed but felt, like a quiet center pulling attention whether people wanted to give it or not. The security guard remained half a step back, his hands now loosely clasped in front of him, no longer reaching, no longer certain, his eyes shifting once more toward the front as if searching for guidance that had not yet arrived. And in that hesitation, something subtle changed. The authority he carried softened, not lost, but suspended, waiting. Ava's fingers relaxed slightly around the invitation, her grip easing as if the tension in her hands had nowhere left to go, and she let the paper rest fully against her lap, her palms open now, empty, calm, a small gesture that carried more weight than any argument, because it showed she was not holding on to anything except the truth of why she was there. The light from the chandeliers above settled across her shoulders, catching the soft texture of her dress, outlining her stillness in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the room itself had decided to stop resisting her presence and simply reveal it. Across the aisle, a woman who had earlier turned away now looked again, this time without whispering, without hiding, her gaze lingering longer, searching not for difference but for explanation, and finding none that fit easily into the quiet assumptions she had carried just moments before. The officiant lowered his voice, not stopping, but slowing, each word spaced with careful intention, as though he understood that rushing forward would only fracture the moment further. And so he allowed the silence to exist between his sentences, allowed the room to breathe, to sit with what it had created. At the altar, the groom's shoulders rose with a deeper breath, one that seemed to reach past the surface, past the practiced calm of the ceremony, into something more personal, more grounded, and his eyes, no longer fixed ahead, drifted again, this time not hesitantly, not uncertainly, but with quiet purpose toward the back of the room. The bride felt the shift more clearly now, her fingers loosening slightly from his arm, not in release but in recognition that something beyond her control was unfolding. Something she could not redirect with a glance or a touch. And though her expression remained composed, there was a flicker beneath it, a question forming without words. Ava lifted her gaze just enough to meet the line of sight once more, not fully, not openly, but enough. And in that subtle alignment, the distance between where she sat and where he stood no longer felt like distance at all. It felt like a connection waiting for acknowledgment. The music from the piano softened into a near whisper, the notes barely touching the air before fading, leaving behind a stillness that was no longer empty but full, charged, expectant. A server near the wall paused completely now, tray held steady, no longer moving between guests. As if even routine had surrendered to the gravity of the moment, the guard exhaled quietly, almost imperceptibly, and stepped back another inch, not retreating, but releasing the role he had been about to play, because something in the room had made it clear that this was no longer his moment to act. Ava remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and in that steadiness, the tension that had once pressed against her now seemed to shift direction, no longer pushing her out, but drawing something else forward, something inevitable, something that had been waiting long before the first note of the ceremony began. And in the quiet that followed, it felt as though the entire room stood on the edge of a single name about to be spoken. The silence reached its breaking point not with a sound, but with a breath, the groom's chest rising slowly, deeply, as if he had been holding something back for far too long. And then he moved, just one step forward at first, enough to draw every eye toward him without a single word spoken, the officiant stopping mid-sentence as if the moment itself had taken control, and the bride's hand slipped from his arm, not pulled away, just left behind as he stepped out of the space that had been so carefully arranged for him. His shoes echoed softly against the polished floor as he turned, not toward the guests in front, but toward the back of the room, toward the place where Ava Johnson sat. Still and steady, her gaze now fully lifted, meeting his without hesitation, without surprise, as if she had been waiting not for the moment itself, but for him to recognize it. A ripple moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, the kind of shift that travels faster than sound. As heads turned, bodies angled, attention realigned all at once, and for the first time since the ceremony began, no one pretended not to see her. The groom's voice, when it came, was not raised, not dramatic, but clear, grounded, carrying across the quiet with a weight that settled into every corner. Before I say anything else, there is someone here I need to speak to. And the words hung there, suspended, because everyone knew now, even before he said it, who that someone was. He took another step, then another, leaving the altar behind entirely, the distance between him and Ava closing with each measured movement. And with every step, the room seemed to shift further away from its original shape, the ceremony no longer a performance, but something real, something unscripted. The security guard stepped aside without being asked, his role dissolving completely as he watched the man he was meant to protect walk past him without hesitation, without doubt. The bride remained where she stood, her expression no longer fixed, her composure quietly unraveling into something more human, more uncertain. Yet she did not stop him, she did not call his name, because even she could feel that whatever was happening now had been waiting longer than this day, longer than this moment. Ava did not stand immediately. She did not rush to meet him. She simply watched as he approached, her hands resting in her lap, her shoulders relaxed, her presence unchanged, and that stillness only made his movement more powerful, more deliberate, because it showed that she had never needed to move for this moment to arrive. He stopped just a few feet away from her, close enough now that the space between them felt charged, visible, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the entire room holding its breath, waiting for the words that would finally break the tension. His eyes softened, the tension in his jaw easing into something deeper, something more personal, and when he spoke her name, it was not as an announcement, not as a reveal, but as recognition, quiet and certain. Ava. And the way he said it carried history, carried meaning that no one else in the room understood yet. A murmur began to rise, confusion threading through it, disbelief, questions forming without answers. But they were all drowned out by the stillness that followed, because that single word had already changed everything, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. And in that moment, the distance that had once defined her presence in the room no longer existed, replaced instead by something undeniable, something that could no longer be ignored or dismissed, because the one person whose voice mattered most had just made it clear that she was not an outsider at all. She was the reason the silence had been waiting to break. The name did not echo, it settled, sinking into the room with a quiet weight that no one could deflect, and Ava Johnson felt it land not as a surprise, but as something long carried finally spoken aloud, her shoulders easing just slightly, her breath deepening as she lifted her eyes fully to meet his, no longer from a distance, no longer through the space of assumption, but directly, openly, as the groom stood before her, close enough now that the rest of the room seemed to fade into a soft blur around them. He did not rush his next words. He did not fill the silence with explanation. Instead, he allowed it to exist, to force everyone present to sit with what had just happened, with the reality that the woman they had avoided was now the center of the moment they had all come to witness. A quiet murmur spread again, but this time it carried a different tone, not dismissal, not certainty, but confusion, curiosity, the first cracks in the narrative that had formed so quickly before. The bride took a step forward at the altar, her voice soft but unsteady as she said his name, not to stop him, but to understand, and he turned his head just slightly, acknowledging her without breaking the moment, without stepping away from Ava, because whatever this was, it could not be undone or postponed. He looked back at Ava, his expression no longer restrained, the composure of the ceremony replaced by something more honest, more grounded, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same quiet certainty. "I should have said this sooner," he began, not loudly, but clearly enough that every person in the room leaned in without realizing it, drawn by the absence of performance, by the presence of truth. Ava did not interrupt, She did not react outwardly, but her hands shifted slightly in her lap, her fingers loosening from the edges of the invitation as if the need to hold on to it had passed, as if the paper had done its job simply by bringing her here. There was a time, he continued, his eyes never leaving hers, when I had nothing, when the world felt a lot colder than this room does right now. And a few guests shifted in their seats, the words cutting through the polished surface of the event, introducing something raw into a space designed for perfection. And the only person who saw me, he said, his voice softening, the only person who did not look away, was you. And the simplicity of it carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have, because it stripped the moment down to something undeniable, something human, across the room. The earlier whispers faded completely now, replaced by a stillness that no longer pushed Ava out, but drew her in, forcing everyone to reconsider what they thought they understood. The security guard lowered his gaze briefly, stepping back fully now, no longer part of the equation, while the woman in the pale gold dress who had questioned Ava's presence earlier sat perfectly still, her expression no longer confident, but uncertain, as if the ground beneath her assumptions had shifted without warning. The groom took a small step closer, closing the last of the distance between them, not in urgency, not in display, but in recognition, and Ava slowly stood this time, her movement calm, unhurried, meeting him at eye level, her presence now undeniable in a way that did not demand attention, but commanded it naturally. The chandeliers above cast a steady light over them, no longer highlighting difference, but revealing clarity, and in that shared space, the room could no longer pretend not to see what had always been true, that the story unfolding was not the one they had assumed, and that the woman they had nearly removed was the one who had shaped the man standing before them. No one spoke, no one interrupted, because the moment did not allow for it. It held them all in place, in the quiet realization that everything they thought they understood had just been rewritten. Not with force, not with confrontation, but with a single name spoken at the right time, by the one person who could not be ignored. No one moved to stop them. No one spoke to interrupt, because the moment had already chosen its direction, and Ava Johnson stood face to face with him, her eyes steady, her expression calm, but no longer distant, no longer guarded, as if the years that had once separated them had folded quietly into this single space between them. The groom exhaled slowly, the tension that had carried him through the ceremony releasing not all at once, but enough to soften the edges of his voice when he spoke. Again, not to the room, not even fully to the woman at the altar waiting behind him, but to Ava. "You were there when no one else was," he said, and the simplicity of it carried more truth than anything formal or rehearsed could have offered, and Ava's lips pressed together gently, not to hide emotion, but to hold it steady, because she understood what it meant for him to say it here, in front of all of them, in a place that had almost turned her away. A quiet shift moved through the guests, not outward, not loud, but internal, visible in the way shoulders lowered, in the way eyes no longer avoided her but lingered, searching now not for reasons to dismiss her, but for understanding they had not considered before. And the woman in the pale gold dress lowered her gaze completely, her posture no longer firm, but reflective, as if the certainty she carried earlier had nowhere left to stand. The bride stepped forward again, this time more slowly, her heels soft against the floor, her expression no longer uncertain but thoughtful, and when she reached them, she did not speak immediately. She simply looked at Ava, truly looked, for the first time since the ceremony began, and in that look there was no dismissal, no assumption, only recognition forming where judgment had once been. Ava turned slightly, acknowledging her with the same quiet presence she had held all along, not seeking approval, not offering explanation, just existing in the truth that had finally surfaced. The officiant remained silent, his book lowered, understanding that the ceremony had already moved beyond anything he could guide, and the piano had stopped entirely now, leaving only the natural sounds of the room, the faint rustle of fabric, the slow rhythm of breath, the subtle shift of people adjusting in their seats as they witnessed something they had not expected to learn. The groom glanced once more at Ava, then gently extended his hand, not as a command, not as a gesture of display, but as an invitation. And after a brief second, Ava placed her hand in his. Her fingers steady, her grip light but certain, and together they turned slightly, not to present themselves, but to rejoin the moment that had been waiting for them both. The distance that had once separated her from the ceremony no longer existed. It had been replaced by something quieter, something deeper, a presence that did not need to be explained because it had already been proven. The guests sat in silence, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of understanding, the kind that settles after something important has been revealed without force, without argument, simply through truth. The light from the chandeliers remained unchanged, warm and steady, reflecting off the polished floor, catching the edges of the chairs, the folds of dresses, the lines of faces that now looked different, not because the room had changed, but because the way they saw it had. And as the moment settled, no announcement followed, no grand declaration, only the quiet continuation of breath, of presence, of recognition. And in that stillness, the ceremony found its way back, not to what it had been before, but to something more honest, where no one needed to look away anymore, and where Ava Johnson stood not as someone who had entered the room uninvited, but as someone who had always belonged, long before anyone else was ready to see it.